the heart of New York City, where stories are written on every street corner, there's one tale that stands apart from the rest. A tale of vengeance, patience, and survival. For 20 winters, Angelica waited. She watched, she learned, and when the time came, she struck with the precision of a storm. 7 men who believed they could destroy her now lie in the wake of her revenge. But who was Angelica really? A woman broken by betrayal, or a force of nature, shaped by a world that never gave her a chance? This is the story of her rise, her patience, and the deadly reckoning that would change the lives of those who thought they could break her. Stay with us. If you're intrigued by this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves a tale of retribution. Now, let's dive deep into the legend of Angelica of New York. Angelica was born into a world of sharp edges and cold winds, the kind of world that only New York City could offer. The streets were never quiet. They hummed with ambition, greed, and survival. To an outsider, the city was a concrete jungle. But for Angelica, it was home, a place where power was earned, not given. As a little girl, she'd watched the world pass her by from the windows of her apartment in the Bronx. Her mother, a woman hardened by years of struggle, would always tell her, "Survive, Angelica. That's the only thing that matters." She didn't quite understand it then, but those words would become her mantra in the years to come. Angelica's father, a man whose face she could barely remember, had vanished when she was just 5 years old. Her mother never spoke of him, and neither did anyone else. But Angelica wasn't dumb. She knew enough to piece together the fragments of conversation she overheard at family gatherings. Her father was no hero. He was a shadow in her mother's past, and shadows, she learned, were just as easily erased as they were cast. By the time Angelica was a teenager, she had already learned the hard lessons of survival. She'd watched her mother make impossible decisions just to keep food on the table. She'd learned to speak without saying a word, to navigate a world where power and trust were commodities. She grew up fast, maybe too fast, but she had no choice. It was either that, or be crushed by the weight of the city's indifference. It wasn't just the streets that were unforgiving, people were, too. Angelica had always been beautiful, though she didn't know it. She never cared to play the role of the helpless girl, waiting for someone to save her. Instead, she became a master of manipulation, knowing when to smile, when to speak, and when to disappear. But despite her growing reputation, there was something darker lurking inside her, a quiet rage that, like her father's absence, was never fully explained. And then came the betrayal. You know the kind of betrayal I'm talking about, the one that changes everything. The kind that shatters you, leaving pieces of your soul scattered like glass across a room. Angelica had experienced many things in her life, but this was different. The people closest to her, the ones she trusted the most, had turned their backs on her. And in that moment, she understood something that would shape her for the rest of her life. Trust was a currency she could no longer afford. But it wasn't the first betrayal, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Angelica learned that life didn't offer second chances. If you wanted something, you had to take it. And if someone tried to take something from you, you made them pay. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The betrayal didn't come from a stranger or an enemy. No, it came from someone she never expected, someone who should have protected her. It came from her own blood, her own flesh. Her cousin, Marco, was the one who betrayed her. They had grown up together, shared memories, laughter, and secrets. He was her partner in crime, the one person who understood the unspoken language of survival. They dreamed of something more than the Bronx dream of escaping the cold, harsh grip of their circumstances. But those dreams, like so many in their neighborhood, were fragile. They shattered the day Marco sold Angelica out to a ruthless gang leader who had been eyeing her for months. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about the way it made her feel, powerless, vulnerable. For the first time in her life, Angelica felt like a pawn in someone else's game, and she hated it. She hated Marco for putting her in that position, and even more, she hated herself for trusting him. But that was the moment she decided she would never be weak again. She would never again allow someone to control her fate. If she had to fight, she would fight. If she had to crawl, she would crawl. But she would never be at anyone's mercy. Angelica's world shifted in that instant. The young girl who had been content with surviving became something else, a woman on a mission. A woman who would not just survive, but who would master the rules of the game and rewrite them on her terms. She disappeared after the betrayal. Ghosts don't make noise. And Angelica? She wasn't going to make noise. She wasn't going to attract attention. For years, she lived like a shadow, unnoticed, unremarkable. She built herself up slowly, using the lessons of betrayal as stepping stones. She learned how to read people, how to study their weaknesses, how to make herself invisible when necessary. It was a lonely existence, but Angelica was no stranger to loneliness, and all the while, the plan was forming in the back of her mind. She would wait. She would wait for the moment when she was strong enough, when she could take back everything that had been stolen from her. The men who had once held power over her would soon learn the price of betrayal. But she wasn't ready yet. She still needed time. Time to grow. Time to become the person she needed to be. As Angelica walked through the streets of New York, the city she knew like the back of her hand, she knew this was just the beginning. The world had betrayed her. Now, it was her turn to exact revenge. It was a game, and Angelica was playing for keeps. The first taste of betrayal is always the hardest. But for Angelica, betrayal wasn't a singular moment. It was a series of small, sharp cuts, each one deeper than the last. She had grown up believing that family was sacred, that no matter what the world threw at her, she could always count on the one she loved. But that belief was shattered the day Marco chose his loyalty to someone else over his own flesh and blood. The irony? It wasn't even about the money, the power, or the deal Marco had made with the gang leader. No, it was something more fundamental. Trust. He had known Angelica's limits, her fears, and her deepest desires. He had seen her vulnerable, seen her dreams for a better life, and he had used that knowledge against her. In the world they lived in, there were few things worse than betrayal. It wasn't just about the personal pain it caused, it was about the erosion of safety, the collapse of everything she thought she could count on. And in that collapse, Angelica found something much darker: anger. But the anger wasn't just for Marco, it was for every person who had ever used her, taken from her, or turned their back on her when she needed them most. It was for the broken system that had raised her, for the people who saw her as nothing more than a commodity, and for the men who thought they could control her destiny. It wasn't enough to hate Marco. No. Angelica's rage was far more expansive. It was the kind of rage that can only be born from a deep, painful betrayal, a rage that, once unleashed, could only be satisfied with something more than justice. It had to be retribution. It had to be final. But how would she do it? How would she make them pay for the years of betrayal? Angelica knew that in order to make her move, she had to first understand the world she was up against. She needed to study them, all the men who had taken advantage of her, the ones who thought she was just another victim. Marco was the first piece of the puzzle. By betraying her, he had set everything in motion. But to truly dismantle the life they had built, Angelica had to get closer to the rest of them, the ones who had played their part in her downfall. At first, it seemed impossible. These men were too powerful, too connected. They walked the streets with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of being untouchable. But Angelica wasn't someone who let obstacles stop her. She watched, she observed, she learned their routines, their weaknesses, the cracks in their armor. One by one, she picked them apart, understanding their every move as if they were pieces on a chessboard. Angelica wasn't just playing to win, she was playing to destroy them, to make them feel the weight of their actions. And that meant she had to be patient. She didn't need to rush. Not yet. There was no room for error. Every step had to be calculated. Every move had to be deliberate. Angelica knew that she couldn't afford to make a mistake now with the stakes this high. But she also knew one thing: when the time came, they wouldn't see it coming, and so she waited. It's often said that time heals all wounds. But for Angelica, time only sharpened the pain. Each day, as the years passed, the pain morphed into something else, something far darker, something far more dangerous. Now, she was ready. But was she truly prepared for what was coming? The 7 men who would eventually meet Angelica's wrath were no strangers to power. In fact, they thrived in it. Each one was a cog in the machine that had ground her down over the years. Some were old associates, some new faces. But all of them had one thing in common: they had taken from her without remorse. Now, they were about to find out what happens when you steal from the wrong person. It's easy to dismiss people like these, the men who move in shadows, their hands never dirty, their words always smooth. They control empires without ever having to lift a finger. But Angelica knew better than anyone that they were the true villains. They had money, influence, and the world at their fingertips. But they lacked something far more important: humanity. And it was this very lack that would prove to be their downfall. The first of the 7 was Raoul, a smuggler with connections everywhere. He had been one of the men who sold her out to the gang years ago. He had no idea how much he had set in motion with that one simple transaction. Raoul wasn't just a criminal. He was a snake, slithering through the underworld with a smile on his face and a knife in his hand. But Angelica wasn't afraid of snakes. She was going to make sure Raoul paid for his role in her downfall. Next, there was Victor, a charming businessman with a dark secret. He owned half the city's legitimate businesses, but everyone knew where his real money came from. Drugs, guns, human trafficking. Victor was untouchable, or so he thought. He had a reputation for being ruthless, but Angelica knew that deep down, he was nothing but a coward. He could be bought, manipulated, and eventually destroyed. Then came Charles, a former cop who had turned to the other side. Charles was a man of principles, at least. That's what he told himself. He had convinced himself that he was above the law, that his badge gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. But Angelica knew better. She knew the truth about Charles, how he had used his position to hurt people, to intimidate, to destroy lives. Charles had no idea how deeply his actions had wounded her, but she was going to make sure he would never forget. After Charles was Lucas, a hitman who had always been a ghost. He worked for anyone who paid him, and he had been involved in taking out people Angelica once trusted. But Lucas had one weakness: pride. He thought he was invincible, that no one could outsmart him. Angelica had been watching him for years, studying his every move. She knew how to use his arrogance against him, as she would. The 5th was Edward, a banker with ties to the worst of the worst. Edward wasn't just about money. He was about control. He manipulated the system, pulled the strings, and made sure his wealth was protected at all costs. But Angelica knew that everyone had a breaking point, and Edward's was closer than he thought. Power built on lies was always ready to crumble. Next, there was Stephen, a corrupt liar who had made his career defending the indefensible. He had helped so many criminals avoid justice, using his influence to silence the voices of the victims. Angelica hated Stephen more than the others because he knew how to twist the truth. He had become a master of deception, and that made him dangerous. But it also made him predictable. And finally, there was Marco, Angelica's own cousin, the one who had started it all. It was Marco's betrayal that had set the course of everything. He had turned against her for power, for protection, for a future that didn't include her. He had chosen the gang, the darkness, over family. And now, he would pay. Each of these men thought they had escaped the consequences of their actions. They thought they were untouchable. But they were wrong. For 20 winters, Angelica had watched. She had learned their secrets, uncovered their weaknesses, and bided her time. She wasn't just preparing to kill them. She was preparing to destroy everything they had built. And she would do it on her terms, in her time. These men had taken everything from her, and now she was going to take it all back. Patience, they say, is a virtue. But for Angelica, patience wasn't just about waiting. It was about strategy, precision, and timing. In a world that ran on instant gratification, Angelica had learned the hard way that revenge wasn't something you could rush. It had to be perfect. It had to be calculated. And more than anything, it had to be inevitable. For 20 years, Angelica lived a quiet life, almost invisible. She became a ghost in the city she once called home, blending in with the crowds, slipping through the cracks, always watching, always waiting. In those years, she made herself into someone unrecognizable. She shed her old skin, the one that had been fragile and trusting, and grew into a woman who understood the value of silence, of secrecy. She learned that silence was often more powerful than any scream. It was how you could strike fear into the hearts of those who thought they were safe. She wasn't just waiting for an opportunity to kill them. She was waiting for the perfect opportunity to break them, to make them feel what she had felt. The betrayal, the fear, the anger. They needed to know what it felt like to be helpless, to be exposed, to be vulnerable. They needed to feel small in the same way they had made her feel all those years ago. And while waiting, Angelica became a master of observation. The city was her canvas, and the people she studied were the brushstrokes. She knew when to move and when to retreat. Every person she interacted with, every event she witnessed, was a piece of the puzzle. She learned the art of influence, how to push people in directions they didn't even realize they were going. She had to be careful, though. If anyone suspected her, her plans would crumble. She had to be patient, but she also had to be smart. In the quiet corners of the city, Angelica honed her craft. She spent years cultivating relationships, some genuine, some not. She learned to manipulate without ever touching anyone. If she wanted information, she knew how to get it. If she wanted someone to do her bidding, she knew exactly how to plant the seed. She used her charm, her beauty, and most of all, her intellect to stay hidden in plain sight. Her apartment in the heart of the city was her command center. It was modest, but every inch of it was organized, meticulous. Maps of the city covered one wall. She had a corkboard with pictures of the 7 men, each pinned to a place on the map where they were most vulnerable. Their habits, their schedules, their weaknesses, they were all there. Angelica had studied them for years, memorizing their every move, learning their patterns until they became predictable. But she didn't rush. Angelica wasn't driven by anger alone. She was driven by the knowledge that each of these men would eventually fall, because they never saw her coming. They thought she was done, but the truth was, she was just getting started. The key to her plan wasn't in her ability to kill, it was in her ability to destroy their worlds. Before they even knew what hit them, she wasn't going to kill them in broad daylight. No, she would do it quietly in the shadows where no one could see. And when it was done, their reputations would be tarnished, their lives shattered, and their families would be left to pick up the pieces. But Angelica wasn't just an avenger. She was an artist, and her art, it was revenge, a masterpiece of patience, precision, and planning. Every day, as she watched the city wake up, Angelica reminded herself that time was her greatest ally. Nothing, no one, could rush her. And when the moment came, it would be worth the wait. The first strike is always the hardest. It's the moment when everything you've worked for is finally put to the test. When the planning, the patience, and the quiet observations culminate in action. For Angelica, the first kill was never meant to be a simple act of revenge. It was supposed to be a message, a declaration that the world she once feared was now hers to command. Raoul, the smuggler, was the first to fall. He had been the one who orchestrated her betrayal all those years ago. The one who set everything into motion when he sold her out. His name was etched into Angelica's mind as the symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life. She had watched him, studied him, waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. She knew his routines, his haunts, his weaknesses. And when the time came, she moved without hesitation. Raul's downfall came on a cold winter's night, ironic, considering how many winters Angelica had endured in silence. He was at a club on the Lower East Side, a place he frequented to conduct his shady deals. The kind of place where the air was thick with smoke, and the sound of laughter never quite reached your ears. It was the perfect setting for something dark to happen. Angelica entered the club unnoticed, blending in with the crowd. Her black dress hugged her curves just enough to make her unassuming yet undeniably attractive. The darkness of the club shielded her movements, making her a shadow in the corner. She wasn't looking for attention. She was looking for him. Raoul was seated in the back, surrounded by a group of men who thought they were untouchable. He looked smug, as always, with a glass of whiskey in his hand and a smirk on his face. Angelica watched him for a few minutes, her heart steady, her mind clear. She'd been waiting for this moment for 2 decades. Now, it was time to collect. She walked to the bar, ordering a drink. The bartender was an old acquaintance, someone Angelica had made sure to befriend over the years. He handed her a glass of wine with a smile. She slipped something into his hand, a silent promise that he would remain quiet when the chaos began. As the minutes passed, Angelica's mind ran through the steps of her plan. She knew the exact moment to strike. Raoul would be walking to the back alley to meet another contact, a routine he followed every Thursday night. He would be alone, vulnerable, easy to take down. When the time came, Angelica stood from the bar and made her way toward the back. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, and precise. She wasn't in a rush. She had all the time in the world. Raoul stood up and began to walk toward the exit, completely unaware of the danger that was about to meet him. Angelica followed him quietly, making sure she stayed far enough behind to remain unnoticed. He stepped into the alley, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. He stopped for a moment to light a cigarette, oblivious to the danger lurking just behind him. And then, it happened. Angelica moved in close, so close that she could hear the soft exhale of his breath. She didn't speak. There was no need for words. She had been planning this for too long to let it go wrong now. With one swift motion, she pushed him against the brick wall of the alley. silencing his protests before they could even form. A single, well-placed strike, and Raul crumpled to the ground. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. There was no time for any of that. The man who had ruined her life was gone, just like that died as she stood over his body. Angelica didn't feel the rush of satisfaction she thought she would. There was no triumph, no celebration, just a cold emptiness, a sense of finality. The first kill had been necessary, but it didn't feel like closure. It felt like the beginning of something much darker, much more dangerous. She had killed Raul, but she knew that the other 6 were still out there, still breathing, still living their lives, and Angelica's work wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The first strike had been made, but the rest were coming. Angelica was never one to live in the spotlight. Even after she had killed Raul, she knew better than to let her actions speak louder than her silence. In the world she inhabited, being visible was a weakness, and Angelica had learned long ago that in the shadows, you are always in control. In the days after Raul's death, Angelica did what she did best: she vanished. She let the city buzz with rumors and speculation, but she kept herself hidden, tucked away in the quiet corners of New York where no one would think to look for her. She didn't need the police chasing after her. No, Angelica had always known that the greatest threats were not the ones that came from the law. They were the ones that came from the men who thought they ruled the world. She had already anticipated the ripple effect Raul's death would have. He was a minor player in the grand scheme of things, but his death would send a message to the others, to the men she was coming for. Angelica wasn't naive. She knew they wouldn't simply let Raul's death go unanswered. They would be watching her, hunting for the woman who had dared to challenge them. But the game had changed. Now, it was Angelica who held the cards, and she wasn't about to show her hand just yet. The shadows were her home. The alleyways, the dim-lit corners of the city, the places where people went unnoticed. These were the places Angelica thrived. She moved like a ghost, always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. The men she was hunting were powerful, yes, but they were too comfortable in their lives, too used to being untouchable. They thought they could live above the rules, but they couldn't escape her. She was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Angelica's next move was subtle, almost invisible. She didn't have to be reckless. No, she was too careful for that. She had learned to make herself scarce, to blend into the background while keeping a close eye on her targets. For weeks, she observed Victor, the businessman who ran half of New York's most profitable enterprises. He was as smooth as silk, never a hair out of place, always surrounded by an entourage. His life was a carefully curated facade. But Angelica wasn't fooled. She knew that beneath that perfect exterior, Victor was just as flawed as the rest of them. He had skeletons in his closet, secrets waiting to be exposed. She knew how to get to him. Victor's weakness wasn't his ego, though. It was large, but his vanity. He was obsessed with maintaining his image. Angelica knew that if she could disrupt that, she could bring him to his knees without ever having to lay a finger on him. And so, she started small. A few whispers in the right ears. A rumor here, a suspicion there. She planted the seeds of doubt in Victor's circle, watching from the sidelines as his once unbreakable reputation began to crack. It didn't take much. People loved a scandal, especially one involving the mighty falling from grace. For weeks, Angelica played the game of shadows, pulling invisible strings, manipulating events without ever showing her face. She wasn't just breaking them physically, she was breaking them mentally. She was dismantling their carefully crafted worlds, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the ruins of their pride. But the game wasn't without risks. Angelica had to be careful. One wrong move, one slip up, and everything she had worked for could come crashing down. The men she hunted were dangerous, but they were also smart. They weren't going to give up without a fight, and Angelica knew that sooner or later, they would start looking for her. They would begin to trace the clues, piece together the patterns, and figure out who was behind the chaos. But that was the challenge, wasn't it? The thrill of the hunt. The feeling of being always one step ahead, always just out of reach for now. Angelica remained hidden in the shadows, content to watch as her plan unfolded. She had already taken down one. Victor would be next. But there were still 6 left, and the game, as always, was just beginning. Angelica had always known that the second kill would be more difficult than the first. The first was a message, a statement to herself, a declaration that she had the power to strike when she chose to. But the second was where things started to get personal. It was when her plan began to take shape, when she started to feel the weight of the consequences of her choices. And this time, it wasn't just about vengeance, it was about sending a warning to the rest of them. Victor was not someone Angelica could simply eliminate in a dark alley. No, he was far too influential for that. His reach stretched across the city, embedded in the high society, hidden behind layers of protection and wealth. His life was a fortress, and to breach it, Angelica had to become a part of that world. She needed access, she needed information, and most importantly, she needed to get close enough to him to ensure that when the time came, the strike would be swift, untraceable, and final. Victor's vanity, she knew, was his Achilles heel. It wasn't enough that he ran his empire. He needed to be admired, worshipped even. He thrived on the attention, the praise, the power he exerted over others. He had an ego the size of the city itself, and Angelica was going to use it against him. She spent weeks weaving herself into the fabric of his world. It wasn't difficult. Victor liked the idea of having a woman at his side, who seemed to match his stature. Someone who could navigate the same high society circles he moved in. Angelica used her charm, her wit, and her beauty to work her way into his confidence. She played the part of the sophisticated, alluring woman who could hold her own among the city's elite. But beneath that polished exterior, she was all business. She wasn't there for the luxury or the attention. She was there for him. Victor didn't see it coming. He saw Angelica as a conquest, another woman to add to his list of admirers. He had no idea that the woman sitting next to him at his expensive restaurant, sipping wine and laughing at his jokes, was the very same woman who had already torn apart one of his associates. To him, she was just another beautiful face in the crowd, but to Angelica, he was the second piece in her grand design. And when the time came, she would take him down with the same precision she had used with Raoul. But she had to be patient. Victor had to trust her completely. He had to let his guard down. The night of their planned meeting arrived. It was a gala lavish event that Victor had hosted in celebration of his most recent business deal. It was the perfect setting for Angelica to make her move. The ballroom was packed with New York's elite, everyone vying for attention, for approval, for a taste of Victor's success. The air was thick with greed, ambition, and desire. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Angelica had already secured a seat beside him at his table, strategically placed where she could make the greatest impact. She watched him with a calmness that betrayed nothing. She had done this before, and she would do it again. As the night wore on, Angelica kept her focus sharp, her movements graceful. She knew that Victor was getting comfortable to comfortable. His attention shifted from business to pleasure, from deals to distractions. He had started to take his empire for granted, and that was when the cracks began to show. She took note of his small, careless actions, his increasing reliance on alcohol, his light flirtation with the women around him. When the final toast was made, Angelica knew the moment had arrived. She had waited long enough. The plan she had meticulously crafted was about to be set into motion. As Victor leaned in to kiss her on the cheek in front of his guests, she slipped a small, concealed syringe into his side. The contents would not kill him, at least not immediately, but they would put him out of commission long enough for Angelica to make her escape. It was the perfect move, clean, silent, and effective. Victor staggered slightly, his vision blurring as the drug took effect, but no one in the room noticed, at least not yet. They were caught up in the celebration. Angelica smiled, excused herself from the table, and disappeared into the crowd. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Victor would be in no condition to defend himself. This wasn't just about killing him. It was about sending a message to the others. Angelica was coming for them. One by one, they would fall, with Victor incapacitated. She felt the weight of the plan beginning to take shape. The second target had been struck, and with it, her vengeance was moving closer to its final act. The world Angelica had built in the shadows was starting to unravel, and she could feel it in every corner of the city. After Victor's collapse, the ripple effects were already being felt. His empire, though not yet in ruins, was trembling. Rumors spread like wildfire among the elite circles of New York. Whispers of a mysterious figure, someone who had taken down Raoul, and now brought even Victor to his knees. The men she hunted, the ones who believed they were untouchable, began to notice the shift. They weren't just feeling threatened. They were starting to panic. It was the moment Angelica had been waiting for, the convergence. The point where her meticulously crafted plan began to come to life. Her targets were no longer safe. no longer certain that they could sit back and enjoy their lives of power and privilege. One by one, they were beginning to realize that they were no longer the ones holding the cards. Angelica was. But as her influence grew, so did the risks. The men she saw were dangerous, ruthless. If they had any inkling of who was taking them down, they wouldn't hesitate to strike first. Angelica had always known that sooner or later, the game would become dangerous. She couldn't hide forever. Eventually, her name, her reputation, would rise to the surface. The real question was, would she be ready for it? This was the moment when everything started to converge, when the pieces of the puzzle that Angelica had spent years assembling began to fall into place. The remaining 5 targets, Charles, Lucas, Edward, Stephen, and Marco, were no longer just distant figures in her mind. They were now people, real people, who had heard the whispers and began to feel the weight of her vengeance bearing down on them. It was no longer just a matter of picking them off one by one. The remaining targets would have to be dealt with in a way that was far more methodical, far more public. They could no longer be eliminated quietly in the shadows. The time had come to break the silence. Charles was first in Angelica's sights. He was a former cop, now a mercenary, always one step removed from the law. The thing about Charles was that he prided himself on his connections. He was a man who had once worn a badge, and with it, he had built an empire of fear. But Angelica knew his weakness, pride. He believed himself invincible, untouchable, and that arrogance would be his undoing. She began to weave the perfect storm around him slowly, subtly. Information was power, and Angelica knew how to turn the smallest whispers into earthquakes. She planted a story in the right ears, a story about Charles and his illegal dealings, about the people he had betrayed in his rise to power. The rumor spread like wildfire through the criminal underworld. Soon, the authorities were involved, and Charles found himself in the middle of a full-blown investigation. His once impeccable reputation began to crumble, piece by piece, but Angelica wasn't done. She knew that Charles was a man of action, and he wouldn't let this investigation sit idle. He would fight back. He would make an attempt to take her down. And that, Angelica knew, was exactly what she wanted. With Charles distracted, she turned her attention to Lucas, the hitman who had once worked for her enemies. He was an elusive ghost, a man who killed for money without ever leaving a trace. But ghosts, Angelica knew, were easy to hunt. They left a trail, even if it was faint. She began tracking him, learning his habits, his hiding places. Lucas thought he was untouchable, but Angelica was patient. She knew the best way to catch a ghost wasn't by chasing it. It was by waiting for it to make a mistake. And Lucas would dot as the tension mounted. Angelica could feel the storm gathering. The city was on edge, and so were the men she had been hunting. But what they didn't realize was that this was the final act. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about power, her power. Angelica had become the force they never saw coming. The convergence was almost complete. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now there was no turning back. Angelica was about to finish what she had started. But she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of the end. The night was thick with tension. The kind of tension that gnawed at the edges of reality and blurred the lines between fear and inevitability. Angelica stood at the center of the storm she had created, watching from the shadows as the final pieces of her plan came together. Her remaining 5 targets, Charles, Lucas, Edward, Stephen, and Marco, had no idea what was coming. But Angelica had been patient, and now, the reckoning was upon them. Die had all led to this. The careful manipulation, the whispers, the quiet takedowns, everything had been a calculated move. Angelica had made them doubt themselves, made them question their own safety. But now it was time for the final act, and this time, it would be different. She wouldn't simply watch from the sidelines anymore. The game had shifted, and she was about to become the one who controlled it all. It was Charles who would be the first to fall in this final confrontation. The investigation had hit a tipping point, and the walls were closing in on him. The authorities were breathing down his neck, and the criminals he had once controlled were beginning to turn on him. Angelica knew that Charles would do anything to save himself. He would become desperate. Desperation was a dangerous thing, and in his panic, Charles made the one fatal mistake that sealed his fate. Angelica had been carefully orchestrating his downfall. But when the time came, she didn't need to lift a finger. Charles, in his blind fury, attempted to make a deal with the very people who had been working to take him down. He made a fatal error. He thought he could use them to strike back at Angelica, but they had their own plans. Within hours, he was arrested, his reputation shattered, his empire crumbling before him. Charles had failed to see it coming. Next, Lucas, the hitman who thought he was always in control. But control, Angelica knew, was an illusion. She had followed him for weeks, patiently watching for the right moment to strike. The moment came when Lucas, in an effort to protect his reputation, tried to silence someone who had been leaking information about him. That was the opening Angelica needed. She stepped into his world, just long enough to deliver the blow that would leave him exposed and vulnerable. Lucas didn't even see her coming. With two of her targets down, Angelica turned her attention to the remaining three. The game was drawing to a close, as she knew it was only a matter of time before the last moves were made. Edward, the banker who had manipulated the system for years, was next. Angelica knew that Edward's arrogance would be his undoing. He believed that his wealth could protect him, that nothing could touch him. But Angelica had learned to play on the one thing that had always eluded him, his greed. She engineered a financial scandal that implicated him in a scheme far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. Edward tried to fight it, but his web of lies unraveled too quickly. His name, once untouchable, was now tainted forever. Stephen, the corrupt lawyer who had twisted the law for his own gain, was already on Angelica's radar. His fall came not from the usual methods of power, but from his own pride. He had long believed that he was untouchable, that his reputation as a master manipulator would always shield him from any consequences. Angelica played into his ego, feeding him the idea that he could outsmart her. But in the end, it was his arrogance that brought him down. A single misstep, one false move, and Stephen found himself tangled in a scandal so vast it left him with nowhere to hide. And then there was Marco, the one who had started it all, the one who had betrayed her, Angelica's cousin, her blood. For years, Marco had been the last piece of the puzzle that needed to fall into place. But Angelica wasn't blind to the fact that the final reckoning would be the hardest of them all. Marco wasn't just another man on her list, he was family, and family betrayed her. He had no idea what was coming. Angelica had planned every detail, every word, every movement. The confrontation with Marco would be swift, final. She didn't need to say anything. There were no words that could make up for the pain he had caused her. She simply did what needed to be done, exactly how she had planned it. Exactly when she had planned it. With Marco's death, the final thread of her vengeance was severed. The 7 men who had destroyed her life, who had made her wait in silence for 20 winters, were no more. But even as Angelica stood in the aftermath, watching the wreckage of their lives, she realized something. Revenge had never been as satisfying as she imagined. There was no joy in it, no victory. There was only the emptiness of knowing that it had all been necessary. The reckoning was over. And yet, Angelica felt as if the story had only just begun. The aftermath was quieter than Angelica had imagined. The city, so full of life and noise, felt hollow in the wake of the 7 men's downfall. Their absence created a void of silence where once there had been power, pride, and fear. Angelica knew that the world she had once inhabited would never be the same. She had set out to destroy them, to break them, to make them feel the weight of their betrayals. And she had succeeded. But in that success, she found herself standing in a new kind of emptiness, one that felt strangely disconnected from the vengeance she had once craved. Angelica never asked for this legacy. She never sought to become the figure that everyone whispered about in hushed tones. But now, as the dust settled, she found herself staring at the result of her choices. The men she had killed weren't just enemies, they were part of the system that had kept her down. But as she watched the city move on without them, Angelica realized that, in the end, their absence didn't make the world a better place. It simply made it quieter, as she, too, had become part of that quiet. In the months following their deaths, rumors swirled. Some people believed Angelica had been nothing more than a shadow, an illusion, a myth. Others whispered her name with awe, with fear, as if she were some kind of avenging angel. But the truth was simpler. Angelica was just a woman who had been betrayed too many times. A woman who had finally taken control of her own fate. The police never found the evidence they needed to tie Angelica to the deaths. They knew she had been involved, but there were no bodies, no hard proof. She had been careful. She had been smart. And so, she remained a ghost in the city, a legend without a face. But even as the years passed, and the memory of her actions faded into the shadows, Angelica couldn't escape the truth. Revenge had cost her more than she was willing to admit. She had lost pieces of herself along the way. Trust, love, humanity, those things had slipped through her fingers like sand through an hourglass. In her pursuit of vengeance, she had built walls around herself so high that no one could ever reach her. And now, standing alone in the quiet of her own life, Angelica realized that the very thing she had sought retribution had only isolated her further. Her legacy would be one of vengeance, yes, but it would also be one of sacrifice. Angelica had sacrificed everything for her revenge, her peace, her soul, and in the end, her connection to the world around her. As she walked through the city one last time, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets, Angelica couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? Was the destruction of those men worth the destruction of everything else? There were no answers, only silence, and with that silence came the truth that sometimes the greatest cost of vengeance is the part of yourself you lose along the way. Angelica disappeared from the city, from the world, like a shadow slipping into the night. Her name would live on in whispers and legends, but she herself would never be found again. Her story, like the vengeance she had wrought, had come to an end, but somewhere, in the quiet of a forgotten corner, Angelica's legacy lingered, a reminder that sometimes the price of justice is far greater than the world can bear.